Once again, welcome to the Los Angeles City Historical Society's scholarship program. And once again, I'll introduce Hazel Carias-Urbina and Araceli Ramos. And they're going to be sharing their presentations with us. And we will start with Araceli and hand it over to you.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Araceli. I am a graduate student at Cal State Long Beach studying the history of exploration, the environment, the natural sciences, and conservation. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about the 1956 Machris Brazilian expedition. I'm going to share my screen now. 1956 Machris Brazilian expedition. So before I get into the meat and bones of the presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came across this topic. So back in the summer of 2021, I was lucky enough to get chosen for a Getty Merrill Fellowship at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. I started working there during the research phase of an exhibition centered around the museum's diorama program, which had never really been studied before. We digitized and read through thousands of internal documents from the opening of the museum to the present day, scanned hundreds of images related to diorama construction, field expeditions, taxidermy, and essentially constructed a narrative timeline for the entire museum as we learned about the people that created and worked in the diorama program. I learned about so many interesting people through this reconstruction, from John Rowley, the museum's first taxidermist who got into a little bit of trouble with a grand jury for fighting with a coworker, to Duncan Allen Spencer, a renowned Hollywood backdrop artist who painted a few diorama backgrounds in the museum, all while being colorblind. I could spend hours telling you all about these incredible stories, the incredible stories that we unearthed during this research phase, but I won't, because there's an exhibit opening up in September at the museum that I hope everyone will get a chance to go visit and learn more about the diorama program and all the people who made it. Now, because my interest lies specifically with exploration and the natural sciences, I paid a lot of attention to the expeditions related to the dioramas. I found story after story in the archives where a patron would finance an expedition to specifically get an animal for a diorama that would eventually display the name of the person. Museum staff often joined in on these expeditions because, of course, they were also interested in getting animals for their dioramas, but their primary focus seemed to be gathering as many specimens as they could for the museum's research collections. And although their goals complemented each other, there was a very clear split between them. That is until I came across the Macrises. So Maurice and Paquita Machris were two extremely dedicated patrons of the museum during the mid-20th century. They were passionate conservationists, avid hunters, and amateur naturalists who used their substantial wealth to not only help preserve a record of our planet's botanical and zoological life, but also to help save species from extinction. What made them different from all the other patrons I saw was that they had formed a decades-long partnership with the museum before any dioramas were created. From 1953 to 1963, their expeditions were explicitly undertaken to grow the museum's collections. And because this was the first time that the museum's archives were being digitized, no one had ever really studied them, even though their influence could be seen all over Los Angeles and across multiple zoological institutions around the world. They were the reason that LA Zoo moved to Griffith Park, the reason the Natural History Museum has one of the largest dioramas in the world, and the reason the Arabian oryx was saved from near extinction. They funded expeditions around the world to the Galapagos Islands, Central India, Chad, the Tres Marias Islands, Kenya, Mexico, Venezuela, and of course, to Brazil. The 1956 Brazilian expedition was one of the most biologically impactful field expeditions they sponsored, as it played a key role in the world of natural history museums. It contributed to the growth, development, and distribution of scientific knowledge, acted as a vehicle for conservation and preservation, and helped enhance public understanding and appreciation for the natural world through educational programs, exhibitions, and films. The Machris, the NHM, and the National Museum of Brazil worked together to collect specimens from the Goiás region in Brazil because it was under direct threat from urban development. You'll notice a quote at the bottom of the slide that says, "It was urgent to establish the inventory of its wildlife as it is likely to be damaged by civilization in the near future." I wanted to highlight this quote from the director of the museum at the time, Jean Delacour, because since he shared this sentiment, that area no longer exists. Scientists and historians can now only study the biodiversity of the region through preserved specimens and archival material. And that's what I did. I did research in the archives of the Natural History Museum of LA, the Smithsonian, the Biodiversity Heritage Library, the Huntington, the Santa Ana Botanical Gardens, the National Archives, the US Immigration Records, the Internet Archive, and countless newspaper archives from the LA Times to the Guardian. I also read through an inordinate amount of publications related to the natural sciences, expeditions, dioramas, taxonomy, and conservation from places like Cal State Long Beach, JSTOR, ResearchGate, OneSearch, Academic Search Complete, the Integrated Taxonomic Information System, and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. This is not the full list. It's not even an extensive list because I would be here for hours, but those are where I got most of my primary and secondary sources for this paper. I was really lucky that I was able to find so many publications from historians who had already written about the topics that I was interested in, and from multiple angles. So I found some books directly related to museum expeditions, the history of dioramas, the concept of green imperialism, taxidermy, the history of natural history museums, and conservation that really helped me flesh out this paper. Again, I have a few listed here that I found especially helpful for my research, and I would highly recommend reading any one of them, especially All Creatures by Robert Koer. That was, I think, the most fundamental book that I read. So after all this research and reading, I found that this specific expedition collected 50,000 insects, 6,500 birds, 230 mammals, over 1,200 different species of plant life. It also resulted in the discovery of 60 new zoological and botanical specimens, a public exhibition, 7 educational films, and a new scientific journal called Contributions in Science. It was scientifically and historically significant because it helped advance the biological sciences, revealed the hidden histories of Indigenous collaborators and their contributions to science, showed the impact of international museum networks and their connections to imperialism, and the effects of museum exhibitions on educational programming on the public. Now, there was no way I was going to be able to tackle all of these important topics in one paper. So what I eventually did was separate each of these themes, partnered them with one of the Machris expeditions, and constructed my master's thesis around them. This paper on the 1956 Brazilian expedition was reworked a bit and is now the first chapter of my thesis. I was incredibly lucky to have sort of been given the Machrises and their expeditions through my relationship with NHM. And I just want to give a quick shout out to everyone there who helped me really dive into this topic when I was an intern, and then for all the years after that. Yeah, thank you also to the LAC Historical Society for the amazing scholarship and for a chance to talk about my paper and my project. Again, the exhibition is opening in September. And there's also a publication that's going to be coming out that I was also a part of, so you'll find my name there. And with that, that's it. And we can jump into the Q&A.
That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone would like to learn a little bit more about?
Araceli, you were talking about the fact that I'm sorry, what was this? I will mispronounce it if I try it, so I'm not going to try it. The species that was preserved from extinction.
The Oryx.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So how can you unpack that one a little bit and explain a little bit as far as what the research that they did resulted in what someone else did to preserve the species?
Yeah, so in 1959, they went on an expedition to Chad. And while they were there, they kind of figured out that there were only about 13 wild Arabian oryx still out in the world. And it was literally like just a bit over a dozen, and the species would have gone extinct. So they were extremely wealthy. They had a lot of influential, affluent friends that had connections to larger zoological communities. And they kind of leveraged their power to bring different organizations together, including the San Diego Zoo at the time, the Arizona Zoo, the World Wildlife Fund, to create a world pool that went and caught some wild Arabian oryx, also went to people like the Sheikh of Arabia, got some from his private collection, and created a breeding program that saved the Arabian oryx from extinction. And now they're everywhere in a lot of different zoos. And we have actually, there's a diorama at the Natural History Museum that was made thanks to salvaged specimens from this breeding program.
So do we have any idea what the total population is between wild specimens and those that are bred in captivity?
I don't know the specifics of it. I was a history major, so I have no idea now what's going on, really.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If anyone has any other questions too, if anyone's having an issue with the Q&A feature there, you can also use the chat section there.
Okay, what made the Machris? Yeah, this is Mike again. What made the Machrises so interesting in in the fact that they were passionate about preservation, but they were also gifted with the fact that they had wealth, and so could you explain their backstory a little bit as far as where their wealth came from and how they chose to use it?
Yeah. So I do tackle this a lot in my thesis, where I talk about the fact that Maurice Machris was the son of an oil baron, and Paquita Machris was the daughter of a real estate tycoon. And so that's something that I did have to talk about in my thesis. I'm very aware of where their money came from, and I think what I found most interesting about them was that in the archives, it looked like a very clear 1-to-1 ratio, where you had patrons that were hunters going out to specifically get one specimen for a diorama, like the most impressive thing that they could find and the most dangerous specimen that they could find for a diorama. And the Macrises partnered with the museum for over a decade before they put any money into making a diorama. So from 1953 to 1963, all of their expeditions were solely focused on research, and they used their money to sponsor these expeditions just to kind of increase and be part of these scientific circles, which I found really, really interesting. Yeah, it's because they also partnered, like they also brought together different museums. So you have the Museo Nacional do Brasil, the one that they partnered him with in this one. They also made partnerships with the Smithsonian, and through that they had the Smithsonian and the Natural History Museum also get closer. So it was a lot of community building that they helped do, which I didn't really see with any of the other expedition sponsors.
Now, did they actually travel on these later expeditions themselves?
Yeah, they were part of the team. So I ended up piecing together through some of my archive work. I pieced together the identities of everybody that went on these expeditions. They were always a part of them. They were always co-leaders with one of the major curators of the museum. And yeah, they were always present, always picking things, hunting right alongside the curators. I found a plain manifesto with all of their names on them. I put it on the slideshow, but that was through the immigration records that I was able to find plain manifestos, and they're on there. Yeah.
And so you mentioned among the various things that came out of all these expeditions, there were a certain number of other types of presentables, including films. Do
Yes.
those films still exist? Have they been preserved? Are they digitized? Are they likely to become available at some point in time?
They still exist. They're in the archives of the NHM. I believe the NHM was able to secure a grant to preserve them, so they're going to be on display in the exhibition in September. Yeah, and because NHM is a public institution, all of this archival information is accessible.
Oh, that'll be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We had a question from Stephanie in the chat there of how much time they spent in Brazil.
Just shy of 3 months. Yeah. They took thousands of pounds of food with them. They created new trucks that had refrigerators put inside of them so that they could carry specimens back to the museum, ship them back to the museum. So it was a really big deal at the time. Yeah.
Did you find, is that something that maybe had an influence on future expeditions or other, the way that other museums handled them?
Well, it did for the Brazilian museum. I'm not sure if they left one, but they came back with one less. So I don't know if I think they left one there.
Oh, sorry, they left
a truck.
One of the trucks. Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
And did you find in your research, was there something that did sort of change kind of the way that you think of, like, when you go to visit a museum? Was there something in particular? I'm just thinking about the dioramas. There's such a something I love about Natural History Museum, and I'm a member there and go all the time. Was there something in the process of your research, did you sort of shift your way of thinking about museums in general, or the Natural History Museum in particular?
It did, but in more of a experiential kind of way, because I used to go into the Natural History Museum, and like you, I loved the dioramas, but I always kind of saw them as these like static images of like a preserved Eden kind of thing. And through my research, all of the people that created these dioramas kind of came to life, and I got very attached to certain characters, to certain figures, and so they like history like came to life. As corny as that sounds, I was really impacted with the stories of how these dioramas were created and everything that went in, and all of the good that people were really trying to do, especially the curators, and how much they really wanted to make these spaces that are not normally accessible to the public. So that was really nice to kind of experience and learn.
That's great.
And are those curate stories going to be part of the exhibition when it opens up in September?
They are. I don't know how like detailed they're going to be, because I could tell you now that there's a curator named Fred Truxell, who was the curator of entomology during the 1950s, who had his wife help him type up his dissertation, right? That was the work that I that's how deep I went, but I don't know if that's going to be like in the exhibit, but I have that knowledge if you want to know it.
Now, you mentioned that the region that was being explored in the late 1950s was reported as being endangered, and shortly thereafter, it was in fact gone. And
Yes.
so how close were they to getting in there and getting out of there? And then how much longer after that was that area despoiled?
Within 10 years, they had moved and made buildings there. So it really, in terms of like timeline, blink and you miss it. I think they sort of just got there just in time. So right after that, the Brazilian government wanted to move City Hall there, so they started building all these different buildings to kind of just take over that area. So it's not, yeah, it was gone within a decade. Yeah.
Now, something that seems curious to me is that the photograph that you show with the waterfall and all that, to me, that would seem like that was literally in the middle of nowhere, far away from civilization. And so why, I guess I'm trying to get my brain wrapped around the idea that a government would want to move its political center, its its social center from wherever it was to this pristine, wild, undeveloped area, unless it was literally almost right across the street. So how far away was the government center that was relocated to this wild area? As I said, I'm trying to visualize why they would have done that.
So here's something that I found. Through my research, I found that the NHM had actually sent a member before the expedition went out to take aerial photos of this area that they wanted to get to. And they found that the Brazilian government was actually building new roads so that people could get in there. So there was a direct correlation with access. So they were able, because of these new roads, they were able to get to this area a lot easier. And so it made sense for them to just kind of expand the city and improve the area, is essentially what the Brazilian government was trying to do.
Thanks.
I just had a question there from Stephanie about where was it, maybe specifically.
So it was in the Goiás region. I can get like coordinates if you want coordinates. But yeah, it was in central Goiás.
And really just highlights, I mean, the importance of the work that they were doing in terms of, preservation and sort of capturing a moment that was then, a place that was no longer soon thereafter.
Yeah.
Is there any, I was just thinking too, like Natural History Museum, as far as people, you mentioned the upcoming exhibition, and is there anything in particular that you came across that you feel like people should really go and check out there?
Yeah, so the Natural History Museum is kind of known for having one of, at the time when it was opened, it was the world's largest permanent diorama exhibition. Now it's the largest permanent in North America. But the watering hole where the elephants are, so that was, there's a timeline of this diorama. But the elephants are there because of the Machris. So it'll be an interesting exhibit. And they're also opening up a never before seen taxidermy hall. So there's the North American in the bottom, North American second floor, and then there's the African hall at the bottom. They're opening up one on top that has never been open to the public before. That one's going to be opened in this exhibition. So go see that. Very
cool. Thank you. And here's one more here from Mike. How long did it take to process all of the 1,200 specimens that they gathered?
Oh, years. They were still, I mean, if you look through the contributions in Science Journal, that was a direct result from this expedition. It was like 1959, 1960, 1962. They're still talking about how they just identified a new species from this expedition. So, I mean, years.
Yeah. Amazing. Great. Well, thank you so much. That was really great. And as I say, we'll be sharing the essays at the end, so everyone will have a chance to read more. And one more last, what is next for you? I know you're finishing up your master's there, but what's next?
I'm thinking about maybe doing a doctorate, but I have a lot of professors telling me don't do it. So I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I will hand it over to Hazel. We will hear your presentation, and Yeah, you can just tell us a little about yourself and then jump in.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the webinar to watch our presentations. And I want to congratulate Araceli on her great presentation and on her research. And now I'll be presenting about the research project that I completed last year about the history of Central American organizing at MacArthur Park in the 1980s. So here's a little bit about myself. Last year, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in history from Cal State LA with a minor in Latin American studies. And in my last 2 years of school, I was part of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, which gave me the resources and the guidance to conduct this project. Between January and August of last year, I volunteered at Cal State LA Special Collections and Archives Room. And my time there really inspired me to consider pursuing a career as an archivist. So I'm interested in applying for library science master's programs this fall. And at the time of making this project, I was interested in studying about transnational Central American histories, public history, placemaking processes, social political movements, and archives. This project was heavily influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic, where I was limited to using online archives as my primary source base, and I'll get to talking about what I used later on. So before I get into explaining what the project is, I wanted to address the name very quickly and the term Conspirando. I titled the project Conspirando en Los Ángeles as a reference to the memoir Unforgetting by Roberto Lobato. And in his first chapter, he explains the term conspirar as a Salvadoran concept, and he quotes, this is a quote from his book, an important tradition of going underground to design plans for insurrection. And basically, I wanted to use this term to allude to the efforts of Central American refugees, activists, and organizations who stood against U.S. intervention in their home countries, and even after leaving for Los Angeles, and despite the potential dangers for their safety. In their own limited ways, they showed up through protests and made MacArthur Park their stomping ground. And that's one of the many ways that they formed community and created this inextricable link between place and their identity. So my research question for the project was, put in one way, how did Central Americans in the 1980s use MacArthur Park to highlight contemporary political issues in the United States and in Central America? And I argue that Central American refugees in Los Angeles showed agency in political activism during the 80s and used MacArthur Park as a base for several protests, marches, and demonstrations against US intervention in Central America. And through the evidence I gathered, I identify how the common use of the park connected them with anti-nuclear and labor activists. And over the course of the decade, their activism sought to counteract President Ronald Reagan's conservative agenda across various political issues. And this intersectional support gave the movement a boost and legitimacy when lobbying for changes in local legislation that secured Los Angeles as a sanctuary city. And in answering these questions, or this question, there were three themes that came up that I've outlined here. I start with placemaking, which is the process of shaping a public place for the benefit of the people who will use it. And it became prevalent as I sought to connect how MacArthur Park became a meaningful space to the Central American community, and how its use for protests and marches complicated the place's reputation. Then there's the idea of agency, so one's ability to act on their own will, which I'm going to talk about in an upcoming slide. And lastly, there's reform. And this is where the protests were part of a larger movement, changing social and political attitudes towards the situation in Central America and immigration, which later becomes change in legislation, both locally and nationally. So a little bit of historical background, just setting the scene. The 1980s were a tumultuous decade for Central America. By 1980, the Contra War in Nicaragua had begun. Guatemala had already been experiencing 20 years of civil war, and we're starting to enter a more intense period of warfare. And then lastly, in El Salvador, the guerrillas of the FMLN had begun engaging the Salvadoran military in '79, and the assassination of Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero escalated the violence and suffering of civilians. Between 1980 and 1990, under 1 million Central Americans fled to the US. However, they were systematically denied political asylum because the US government considered them economic migrants, suggesting that they were only leaving to find better economic opportunities. But in practice, it allowed the US government to evade their responsibility in creating this mass refugee migration. The US government has a long history of sending military aid to suppress dissent against dictatorships that protected American business assets and political interests. But as refugees continued to flee and take on the dangerous passage through the southern border, US-based activists saw a need to help Central American migrants find a safe place in the States. In particular, faith leaders became invested due to the increased violence and murders of Catholic leaders in El Salvador, and they decided that if the US wouldn't offer sanctuary to refugees, then they would. In 1982, Reverend John Fife claimed the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, as a sanctuary for housing refugees, defying the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and hence federal law. And in the years following, hundreds of churches would follow suit and begin doing the same. And so Los Angeles became an epicenter for the sanctuary movement, and American sanctuary activists start providing Central Americans with this relief, right? This much needed relief. However, Central American refugees are forced to lay low and to abstain from leadership in these sanctuary groups, one for their own protection, but two for the cause to seem legitimate and urgent. The main way that they're noted in contributing is through consciousness building, where refugees would recount their stories through testimony to mainly American parishioners and audiences. So an effort of this project was to show how political protests organized by Central American refugee organizations are evidence of their agency in this movement and apart from it, that they're participating in demonstrations that are challenging their invisibility in the sanctuary movement. And their agency is also important when we consider many refugees had skills of labor and community organizing that they were bringing from their home countries into LA. And together they found solidarity with each other and created their own advocacy groups. So for example, the Center in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, known as CISPES, and El Rescate, were grassroots organizations built by Salvadoran refugees in 1980, 2 years before the sanctuary movement had officially begun. And then the Central American Resource Center, Carias-Urbina, was founded in 1983. These major organizations are still around today, and they all began because they saw a need to help their community settle into a new city. So Westlake becomes a prime place for settlement in the 1980s for Central Americans, largely because of the cheaper rent and its proximity to downtown, where many service jobs and factory jobs are available. And this came at the expense of dilapidated apartments and substandard infrastructure left behind by a white middle class from the 1950s. Despite arriving in Los Angeles with little to no family and carrying the traumas of extreme violence, Central Americans managed to create community by establishing businesses, restaurants, travel agencies, and even banks in the area. And this is where I want to speak on the geographical position of MacArthur Park, because I think it's really well positioned, like both in its size and its place, to allow for like large demonstrations. And the fact that it's at a really important a busy intersection with Wilshire Boulevard, which connects so many important and densely populated parts of the city, notably downtown, historic Filipino town, you got Pico Union and Koreatown. USC isn't too far away. So we have this park in Westlake that serves as a recreational area for the local community, but when times require for people to call out injustice, then the park gets used as a meeting place for activism. So here's how I found my primary sources. I used Calisphere. That was indispensable to finding photographs of 1980s political protests at the park, where Central Americans and allies had organized either on their own or in conjunction with other movements. And then I searched for news articles from the Los Angeles Times and La Opinión archives that were published around the same time the photo was produced. I then used the Princeton Guide as a guideline for interpreting my primary sources. And for more historical context, to kind of fill in the gaps, essentially, I wrote about changes in Los Angeles legislation relating to immigration and key moments from the Reagan administration. Lastly, I incorporated archival materials that I sorted through as a volunteer at Cal State LA's Special Collections Room. At the time, we had received a large donation of materials related to 1980 Central American organizations. So I took scans of some of the materials that mentioned MacArthur Park or were examples of the kind of difficulties that Central Americans had encountered during this time. And I felt very lucky that I could find those materials there, especially after not being able to access physical archives for some of my time doing this work. So here are some of the primary sources I picked out that I think are kind of fascinating. And we're just going to go through them. So this is one of the first photographs I list in my project. The photograph was taken by Ann Knudsen from the LA Herald Examiner, and it has a simple description about a protest being held at MacArthur Park. But I think the wooden sign in the photograph, it really helps situate where in the park they are. So they're on the south side of the park. That's more the natural landscape side. That's where the lake is. And they're on the intersection of Wilshire and Alvarado. And what I thought was notable was like combining it with this political ad from La Opinión that is from the same day. It's promoting this exact protest, and in the ad they're supporting a general strike, and they're calling for popular insurrection, and it's coming from an organization that I had to translate their name, the Coordinating Committee for the Solidarity with Salvadoran People. And because this is a Spanish language ad, it's promoted particularly to Latinas and more specifically to attract Salvadorans in the area, right, living in Westlake, who are really close to the park and care about this issue. So the reason I point out to it is because of the dates. This rally was held on January 18th, 1981. And on this next slide right here, I have another photograph that it might have been the same protest or the same day, but the date is really important because January 19th is the day that Ronald Reagan gets inaugurated as president. So that poster in the photograph calling for a cut to all military aid to El Salvador, combined with the political ads messages about being against U.S. intervention, really shows their stance here. And we get a notice from La Opinión that you can see on the right, getting news from Washington, D.C. about Reagan planning to send military aid to El Salvador. So we're seeing these really interesting rallies early on that are being organized in like opposition to the Reagan administration, and being organized by and participated by Salvadorans in and at MacArthur Park, organizing closer to home. So that's some of the early evidence I wrote about. And then I wanted to jump around a little bit to cover some of the labor rallies and May Day rallies that took place at MacArthur. So these rallies happened in response to the Reagan administration's government policies that encouraged aggressive anti-union tactics of large corporations. And in this rally on September 6th, 1983, unionists gathered at Levitt Pavilion, which is on the north side of the park, and carried signs in the front rows representing the sheet metal and airline industries. And in the UCLA archive, where I could access this photo, you can zoom in on the image, and it's a little clearer. You can see that some of the protesters declared an anti-war and anti-nuclear stance through their signs, through their poster signs. According to La Opinión, recounting the event, actor Ed Asner appeared at MacArthur Park to deliver a speech on the importance of labor organizing and mentioned his disapproval of Reagan's foreign policy in Central America. And I thought this was important to show because, like I said before, many Central Americans had labor organizing experience, but in their home countries, but it could have resulted in life-threatening repression from the state. So many were reluctant to start organizing in the US. However, some continued their work in Los Angeles, and that shows like a commitment to social justice in their home countries. And occasionally they were rallying at MacArthur Park with these labor movements. So in the 1980s, 80% of Salvadorans and Guatemalan immigrants in Southern California were in blue collar and service occupations. So it's in their best interest to be involved and to understand what's going on with labor organizing in the city. This is one of the more exciting connections I made in synthesizing the sources. This photograph was taken on July 29th, 1984, and the protest was planned to coincide with the start of the Los Angeles Summer Olympics, where Ronald Reagan was set to open the ceremony at the Coliseum. So he traveled to Los Angeles. This newspaper article from La Opinión estimated that about 700 people appeared at MacArthur Park to protest U.S. intervention in Central America. Crowds were led by Reverend Jesse Jackson, best known for his work in the civil rights movement, and at this time he was running for his presidential campaign as a Democratic candidate. And then Professor Raul Ruiz of Chicano Studies at California State University Northridge was also at the protest, and he was quoted in the article saying, We aren't opposed to the Olympics. We oppose the same regime that makes propaganda in favor of the Olympics while paying to kill the youth of El Salvador. So a really poignant quote that's summarizing here the attitudes of the crowd. Crowd chants were in support of the FMLN and called for the CIA to leave Nicaragua. And CISPAS was involved in the march, and by this time they had had several chapters across the country, and they were known for organizing national campaigns. And lastly, the writer of the article, Beatrice Johnson, she stated that they anticipated a larger crowd for an anti-nuclear march in the next month. So I'm going to diverge a little bit from the evidence of the actual protests and to talk about some of important immigration policies floating around at the time. In December 1985, Mayor Tom Bradley and Los Angeles City Council, they signed an important resolution that would instruct city employees not to voluntarily assist the U.S. Immigration Naturalization Service in finding and deporting undocumented people, which really provides some security for undocumented Central Americans in Westlake. And this also reaffirmed a Los Angeles Police Department policy that ordered officers not to arrest people only for being undocumented. So this is important in relation to talking about Central American activists because it adds a layer of safety for the political activities that they're doing at the park and for their general lives. It's also important when we consider again that asylum did not come easy for Central Americans. Throughout the decade, Central American refugees were deported on the basis that they were economic migrants searching for work in the States, as opposed to fleeing political persecution. And in an article written by Victor Marino for the LA Times, there was a statistic that out of 1,233 Central Americans nationwide who qualified for political asylum that year, only 24 Salvadorans and 1 Guatemalan applicant were approved for asylum. Even when Central Americans did apply for political asylum, there's a chance that their application would be rejected, which would prompt the U.S. Immigration Court to send them a notice of deportation. Some people, like William Aquino Don, opted for voluntary departure instead of facing the greater consequences. And this is a copy of his order for voluntary departure from 1986. And then lastly, in 1986, Ronald Reagan signs the Immigration Reform and Control Act into law, which acts as a double-edged sword for undocumented Central Americans across the country. The major downside is that it made it illegal to hire undocumented people, which limits their already limited scope of employment opportunities, and it potentially creates a greater exploitative working situation for them. On the other hand, this act opens an opportunity, like a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people under a few conditions, including the rule that they must have arrived before 1982, from January 1st, 1982. And I wanted to mention this because I had a rare case in this project where I was able to identify the name of a protester and do some research on them. So this is a picture of a young Carlos Vaquerano at a protest. He was photographed at a demonstration at the park about the Salvadoran presidential elections of March 1989, where President Jose Napoleon Duarte was running as an incumbent as the Civil War continued in El Salvador, but was coming to an end towards the end of the 80s. And in a PBS SoCal video, he was interviewed for his migration story and mentions that he found community in activist circles that were interested in helping refugees in LA gain asylum. Because he arrived to Los Angeles in 1981, the amnesty protections from the IRCA gave Vaquerano the chance to become a U.S. citizen. So his story is an example of the impact of this piece of legislation on Central Americans like Vaquerano in Los Angeles and in the country more broadly. And in my thesis, I pose Vaquerano's story as an example of a powerful legacy of community building that emerged from Central American activism in 1980s Los Angeles. So why does this matter for LA history? The evidence shows that the park provided a space for Central Americans to organize despite the pressure to lay low for their own safety. And I think this provides insight into ways that Central Americans carved their space in Los Angeles and making connections with other activists like labor unionists and anti-nuclear activists is part of solidifying their presence in LA. And that support becomes important later on when these pieces of legislation in 1985 and 1986 help transform LA into a sanctuary city. And then lastly, I think this project also adds to a long history of MacArthur Park as a site of resistance. Earlier, I mentioned the geography of the park makes it well suited for large crowds. And these are photos of protests throughout the mid-20th century that show that the park has been, as Meredith Radin, a professor at USC, put it, the favorite gathering spot for Los Angeles' left-leaning political groups. And in this case, it's special that for Central Americans living in Westlake, the park became that important place to strategize and express themselves apart from using it recreationally. So that's really it. I just wanted to thank a couple people. Thank you to my family, both in Los Angeles and beyond. I really wouldn't have the same sort of motivation to do this project without them. And knowing their earliest experiences coming to Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s have really grounded my understanding of this history and the city more broadly. And thank you to my partner, Jackson, for being my #1 supporter. Thank you to my mentors, Dr. Mark Weil, Dr. Enrique Ochoa, and Dr. Camille Suarez, for guiding me as I completed this project as a part of the Mellon Fellowship. And lastly, thank you to the Los Angeles City Historical Society for the scholarship. It's very meaningful to me because past winners like Ariel Hernandez, Jerry Cisneros, Abigail Calderon Garcia, these are people that I've been lucky to meet, and I really respect their work. So to get the same honor, it means a great deal to me. Thank you so much, and I'm a little rusty, but I'll try to my best to answer your questions now.
Thank you so much, Hazel. That was great. Any questions from the chat?
Hazel, in your research, has the role, or I should say perhaps the influence, whether it's implicit or explicit, of the Catholic Church in LA, did it have any weight when it came to the ability of the Central Americans to have public protest? What was there a change specifically when Roger Mahony became Archbishop in late 1986? Because to be perfectly honest, 85, thank you. 85 is the correction I've been given. I can't imagine Timothy Manning having been, being a friend of liberation theology.
Yeah.
During his time. And so when Mahony became Archbishop, did that suggest that there was a sea change between how the Catholic Church, like the Presbyterians in Arizona, allowed these people to express themselves and basically demonstrate their humanity?
I'm really fascinated that you mentioned Roger Mahony, because that's a piece of evidence that I wasn't, like a primary source I wasn't able to include in the presentation. It's interesting because I have cited in the essay I think it's a flyer. It's a flyer that notes that he was hosting Central American Week. That's the name of the demonstration that happens at MacArthur Park. I think in '88. That's the actual date. Let's see. Yeah. 86. So I think the role of the Catholic Church, I mean, Catholic churches have a big presence in Los Angeles, especially in relation to the Latino community. So I think that this understanding is really urgent and essential to the success of Central American refugees and just people trying to survive in the city. Like, it's important to that kind of support and feeling that these demonstrations are going to be supported and accepted. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that it's interesting you mentioned Roger Mahony. It's a while that I didn't get to include that. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. I saw that and I thought I gotta ask about that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
We have a few questions from the crowd, actually. Claudia, I see your question. I just want to jump to Mark's and then we'll jump back just because you mentioned, we're talking about the sanctuary movement churches. Mark asks, he's curious if what you learned from the project about the relationship between the sanctuary movement churches and the grassroots groups like El Rescate and Carias-Urbina. Did they cooperate, coordinate? Was there friction, disagreement?
Oh, well, I know from how do you call it? I know certainly that, like I said, Central American refugees certainly benefit from the aid of American activists, and that's not to be overlooked. But I think that there was this kind of feeling to want to separate themselves a little bit as a form of a little closer to, how can I say it, providing more like mutual aid and closer connections within their networks, like that's kind of a reason to break off. However, I from what I saw, that connection is still pretty important. There's I didn't encounter any frictions between the sanctuary movement's leaders and Central American leaders from their own advocacy groups, but I'm sure that maybe there's evidence towards that. Yeah, that's what I've got.
Thank you. Claudia asked, what challenge did you face while researching the subject?
Ooh, a couple. And that's how it goes with research. I would say one was acquiring the actual archival materials, like finding the evidence, because I had these photographs, and while that was amazing to find, there's only so much you can interpret from photographic evidence, especially when you consider like the fact that these were taken by journalists, and maybe they have a certain agenda in how they portray the news of these demonstrations, right? So that was one. The total amount of evidence that I have is correlated to like about 6 years in the 10-year decade in the 1980s that we're talking about here, that the project covers. And then I cover a couple later tangential years, particularly 1992, when the peace accords get signed, and there's a rally at MacArthur, essentially, and it was hosted by Father Luis Olivares. Essentially as a wrap to everything. So that was one, and then the second one I think is a little more personal. It was the idea that I'm doing a project that is close to my family's experiences of living here in Los Angeles, close to my heritage, and wanting to do right by the work, with having very little to work with. But I I try to make magic essentially, and I took a lot of inspiration from, or not inspiration, but pointers from microhistorians, and from microhistory methods. So even though it's across a decade, these are individual events, and I have to really look for details that are gonna fill in the context for what was happening on that day, in that time, who was there, etc. So.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm sure having that personal connection would be inspiring, but also, can bring up all sorts of feelings and
yeah, certainly.
But thank you. A few more questions here. We have anonymous attendee. Do you know how does a protest work? How does a protest group decide between MacArthur Park or Westwood, Federal Building, or someplace else?
Sure. So, I mean, I chose MacArthur Park as the focus, but the choice is depending on what they're marching for, what they're protesting for. I mentioned in my thesis that I didn't include some of the protests and demonstrations that are happening nearby, especially at like the INS buildings and city buildings. At City Hall, MacArthur Park is serving as like an intermediary place. Sometimes it starts at it sometimes is like the starting place for some of these marches, and then they go somewhere else, or they'll be the ending places. So I mean, I found that in the evidence, they basically MacArthur Park is seen as this common meeting ground, especially when they want to get the attention of Americans to join. And that's I didn't mention it here. I don't have it in my presentation, but there's an image of the band shell covered in banners of several different Central American organizations. And so I think that's with the knowledge of knowing that that's an accessible place for people who are interested in this work to go, for Central Americans to go there. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Comment and question from Esther. Outstanding work, Hazel. You've mapped such an important narrative of Central American activism. Besides Bejarano, who did you interview, or who else would you like to interview? And what is your next step in the research?
Oh man, so I should clarify that the interview with Carlos Baquedano was conducted by PBS SoCal, so I didn't do that interview. However, I did have ideas for oral histories much earlier on, and I didn't get to explain this, but before this project came around, I was more focused and was dedicated to making this research project about an organization called COFECA. It's a Confederation of Central America. That's their acronym. And essentially, this is a group that's been around since 1983. And that emerged out of this important time for Central Americans in LA. And they host the Central American Independence Day Parade here in Los Angeles. And I was initially interested in how the parade provides a form of visibility for Central Americans. And so I was interested in seeing if I could find the oldest members of the group. And so I guess those are the people that I would consider interviewing in a future pursuit of this project. At the moment, there are no plans to continue this particular project. My interests are they lie elsewhere, especially because now I'm a little bit more invested in learning more about archives. And I work at the Southern California Library currently, and so I'm getting to learn a lot about the field of archives. But certainly there's a lot of room for this project to grow, especially with more access to different archives. I mean, CSUN has a huge Central American archive that I wasn't even able to go to. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that helps now. Like you mentioned, when you started during the pandemic, it was limiting in terms of where you could go, but
yeah, especially oral histories, to conduct oral histories. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, maybe, well, I'm just thinking of that too. Did you find, as much as that was maybe a challenge, was there anything about it that maybe sort of helped in or sort of changed the way maybe you approach the project?
That helped. I mean, being at special collections really helped to create some more context for that historical moment. To create to just get more informed about what was going on and what organizations existed, and just so I could keep my eye out in case I had found in the photographic evidence or in the newspaper articles those same names. So that was really helpful. And having the the newspapers and the photographs online, I think it's easy access, easier access. So yeah, those were helpful.
Cool. And Mike had a question there. Did your research reveal how the Central American voices tried to separate themselves from the anti-nuke, Chilean dictatorship, Contra war, other sort of other issues and protests?
Sure. Yeah. I do have some photographs and newspaper articles that explicitly say that those protests were held by Central American advocacy groups, and that's really the only presence there. So they're carving out their own space and not really invested in having any anti-nuclear or labor activists at the moment in that crowd. The picture of Carlos Baquedano, it coincides with another photograph that seems where that seems to be the case. And an interesting thing when mentioning the Contra war, because, well, two things. There's a really big representation of Salvadoran activists in this work. I don't think that there's not really a lot of Guatemalan or Nicaraguan specifically, activist groups that really appeared when I was doing this work, but I wanted to keep it open because you know, I don't want to generalize what types of people might be in the crowd and who's really paying attention. You know, there's that, like, even though they're from different countries, these activists are most likely working together. With the Contra War, there was one image that I didn't include in my essay that I wish I had, because it has this really interesting, it's not necessarily a leftist take, it's actually in support of the Contra War. And I imagine that there was this like separation between the Central Americans that were for the Contras and those that weren't, that were against the US sending military aid and supporting the Contra War. So yeah, that was an interesting image that I had found from Calisphere that I wish I had included, because I think it would have provided a little bit more, maybe like a weird counter argument or counter evidence or whatnot to the presence of leftist Central American activists, just complicating the narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, yeah, like beyond that sort of example, if there were other like counter protests or any sort of any other questions from the crowd, just to check in here. I think that might be it. Is there anything else you wanted to add or conclude?
Well, I would say, you know, thank you so much for paying attention to the work. I think that this is a really nice opportunity to get to present this work that I've had a lot of feelings and thoughts on it over a year now, because I finished it last year. So this is kind of like a nice send-off. Maybe at some point in the future I'll revisit it. And you know, U.S. Central American histories will always be close to my heart. But I'm looking forward to this next chapter where I pursue archival studies, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot more. So.
Excellent. One last, I guess, in this actually, maybe we could open up to Araceli too. But any recommendations what recommendations do you have for other researchers?
Whoa, that's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is, and this is easier said than done, but don't be afraid to go to archives. Like there's this kind of like, I knew when I was an undergraduate, even though I was a history major and archives are really important to conducting historical research, I was quite like nervous to visit any archive. The first visit I had to one was after like a long time of me trying to like hype myself up, and it was to the Center for the Study of Political Graphics. And I just met these really interesting people who were really invested in history and could tell me more about the materials. Like, I think that is one thing that I would recommend to researchers is you know, go for a wide scope of archives, even if you think that they might not have something, they might surprise you. That's certainly the case at my current workplace at the Southern California Library. I mean, we have so many collections that you know, are both processed and unprocessed, and we have an attitude of just letting people see what they need to see, what they're looking for. So yeah.
I can also just say, don't be afraid to email the archivists and the librarians. I don't think I would have found some of the more detailed documents that I would have without the help of the archivists, because I mean they live and breathe in these spaces that we as outsiders would only get to visit once, twice, a couple times, but you know, they're there every day. So I contacted someone at, for example, at the Smithsonian, that I would have been like, with all their boxes and all of their catalogs, I would have been completely lost. And with one email, they helped show me where to go, and I found like a ticket for one of the film like premieres of the Machris. I was like, there was so much that I would not have even thought about looking for or asking about. So definitely step one, archivists, librarians.
Yeah, never underestimate the ability of an archivist to, if not answer the specific question that you have, respond by saying, well, can you give us more context? Because in our particular case at the city archives, when you're dealing with anything, say, going before the city government in the 1980s, for example, we probably have a certain amount of documentation that might be useful, but we won't know unless you ask. And quite often in the research that we do to determine, well, do we in fact have this? We may discover, oh my God, we have this. And we may have some other assets that might, help fill out the picture, depending on, one question will lead to 5 other questions. One answer may in fact lead to 10 other questions. And yeah, I mean, we don't have as much time as we would like to do all of the work that we'd like to do, but I got to tell you, research is the greatest amount of fun I have during my workday. And so anyone who comes up with an interesting question, with something that gives me an opportunity to learn something that I had not anticipated learning when I first got to work that day, that's a blessing to me. And so, yeah, I would echo your sentiments exactly. Always ask the archivists.
So we have another archivist in the crowd there. Renee also said that you just made her year.
Aw.
I will also say I would like to share a fun story. So I mentioned during my presentation that there was the taxidermist named John Rowley. So by the time that I had jumped on the exhibition project, they had already been working on it for about 2 years, and they had been searching for this grand jury trial report for about 2 years. And one day I just thought, I'm just gonna ask an archivist at the LA Law Library and see what they know. And they were like, yeah, give us like a day, I'll reply to you. And they found this grand jury report, this elusive 2-year search and I just, with one phone call, and they were like, yeah, we found it in the flooded basement of our archive thing, but here you go. And they gave us the PDF version of it. So,
Wow.
I mean, that's how important partners the archivists are to historians, because I literally one phone call and we got it. So yeah, thank you to the archivists of the world.
Yeah.
And let me jump on with just one more statement, because I was actually talking to an intern today from UCLA. I pointed out to her that if you are relying solely on online resources, you are shortchanging your research efforts, because most of the materials that exist are not going to be online. You can't Google most of the stuff. For a variety of reasons, most materials that an institution is likely to have are not going to be digitized. And so that means you do have to reach out to the archivist, to the records manager, to whoever it is that will be in a position to respond to you and say, oh yeah, we also have this. And so do not assume that online resources are the beginning and ending of your research. Anyone who does that is going to fail. And I'm sure that both of you and your colleagues who have actually done the work by actually reaching out to archivists, going to libraries, going to the various institutions that you've mentioned in your research, if you can, you will discover that there is so much more material that is just waiting to be discovered. And if it's waiting to be discovered, it means it's not being used by anyone else, and that's a shame.
Take a pause there and just thank you both again so much for your presentations. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And thank you, Mike, for your help as well. I'm just going to drop a couple links in the chat here. We'll also be sending everyone a little thank you email, which will include links to the recording as well. But wanted to drop the link in there for our scholarship page, which explains a little more about the scholarships, and also provides links to the essays that were submitted. And you can even go back and watch previous webinars with our previous scholarship winners as well, and read their essays too. So that is great. And I'm also going to drop all the links in the chat for y'all. Just our events page in general. That way you can keep an eye on our upcoming events. Like I say, if you're not already a member, really invite and encourage you to join. Being a member and donating to the Historical Society really helps programs like our scholarship program, and allows you opportunities to join us for some really fun events, such as our city archive tour. Get to explore the archives there, speaking of. And then lastly, our just a reminder of our gala on coming up on May 19th, and hopefully you all can join us for that. I'll put that link straight in there. And with that, I want to thank you both again, and thanks for everyone for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording, and we're welcome to head out.